day, my Menopause. I'm so glad you remembered to come back for more information on your brain from the standpoint of menopause. This is the unit on Alzheimer's disease, and it's something everybody wants to avoid, and you can. You just have to know what it requires to do so. Alzheimer's is all of chapter 33 in my book, regardless of which edition you have, first or the second. And we started this Alzheimer's unit in video number 236. So this is the fifth one in the unit. And other than telling you that it's a unit on Alzheimer's, I haven't even talked specifically about Alzheimer's yet. And that's because I'm very methodical. I don't just stand in front of the camera and start jabbering. I plan these videos, and I'm very careful about the order in which I deliver the information. So even though this is the fifth video, I'm still not going to even mention the word Alzheimer's in the actual lesson. Instead, I'm going to continue building the foundation for your later understanding of Alzheimer's. So far, you know that you have gray matter and white matter. The gray matter is all the neurons that form connections so that information can travel from one neuron to the next. The white matter is the fatty myelin coating around the neurons that insulates them so that they can transfer more information faster. And all of this serves to make it possible for you to process information in the right side of your brain and store it in the left side of your brain. And once you've stored it, you can rely on memory to retrieve it. It's like recycling. Your memory enables you to retrieve old information to use again and again and again. So today, we're going to address all your different kinds of memory. This video is important because it will help you understand what happens to your brain if you get Alzheimer's. So, we use the word memory in a very general sense. And we all know the meaning of memory, but just for the sake of completion, I'll start by defining it. And you'll need to remember this definition for future videos. Yeah, you have to exercise your memory in the unit on Alzheimer's. Memory is the ability to retain and recall information. But here's the critical thing about memory. It develops as a result of repetition and repeated use of information. Have you ever thought about just how many different kinds of memory you have? They aren't all the same, I think specifying them helps to later understand some of the things that happen if you get Alzheimer's. Oops. I forgot. I said I wouldn't mention the word Alzheimer's. All right, let's see how many different kinds of memory we can list. Okay, I think the most basic kind of memory is emotional memory. Emotional memory is exactly what the words imply. It consists of remembering your emotions. This is something that happens typically without your knowledge. Every interaction you have with another person and every situation you encounter creates memories of the experience that you store in your brain. Sometimes you never retrieve those memories again simply because you never revisit the person or situation that created them in the first place. Nevertheless, if you encounter a similar person or situation, you might retrieve that emotional memory and rely on it again. Your emotional memory comes into play for just about everything. Everything you love is due to your emotional memory. Everything you hate is due to your emotional memory. Your behavior is due to your emotional memory. I think it even gets stored in other parts of your body, like your gut. Haven't you ever noticed how your gut reacts to things? That's why people say, go with your gut. What they're really saying is, go with your emotional memory. I'm always coming up with goofy maxims that turn out to be not so goofy. And when I tell my friends some of these maxims, they tell me they're pretty accurate. One of them is what I call the caller ID test. You know how you can see the name of the person who's calling you on the screen of your phone when it rings? That's caller ID. Well, the caller ID test is when you pay attention to your very first gut reaction upon seeing that name. Does your gut relax or get excited? If so, it means you're happy to see that person calling. But if your gut clenches or turns a somersault, it means that you're dreading the call from that person. And I always say that you should use the caller ID test to be aware of what each relationship is doing to you. And maybe you should weed out the ones that clench your gut. But why does your gut react one way or the other? Because of emotional memory. Over the course of your relationship with that person, you have stored information that has summed up in either a positive or negative way, such that the overall effect on you is either good or bad. And that's a good place to move on to the next kind of memory, actually, which is muscle memory. Now, this is just what the name implies too. It's the memory of movement. Do you have to concentrate on how to walk? What about how to chew your food? Most likely these are things you learned a long time ago, and now you do them without thinking at all. You don't sit at the table in front of a plate of food thinking, how do I chew this again? You don't forget the motor movements that you've done over and over and over. If you're a musician, a dancer, or an athlete, you rely on muscle memory a lot. Your body knows what to do even if you are thinking about something else completely. In fact, sometimes if you think too much about what you're doing, you mess up. It's almost as if the memory has moved from your brain to your muscles. And once it does that, it becomes somewhat automatic. Oftentimes when I play the piano, my mind is miles away. My hands just know what to do. But if I catch myself and try to concentrate on my piano playing, I sometimes mess up. My hands know the music better than my brain does. Next is orientation memory. Orientation refers to knowing personal and current information. In medicine, we assess mental status by determining if someone is oriented to person, place, and time. We call it oriented times 3. If you are oriented to your person, you know your name and when you were born. If you are oriented to place, you know where you are, meaning this country, the city, the street, or the building. If you are oriented to time, you know the year, the month, and the day. Certain medical problems interfere with one's orientation. And in those cases, you may not know who you are, where you are, or what year it is. In healthy individuals, these things seem very elementary, and they are. But a problem in your brain can impair your memory with regard to orientation. The next kind of memory is episodic memory. Episodic memory is the ability to remember something in context. It involves distinguishing between things you stored in your brain as a result of seeing them versus hearing them. Episodic memory is what you use to remember specific events. It's how you store memories for how or when something happened. And it takes effort because you have to put it in context. It's easy to forget the context or to change the context. And when that happens, the accuracy of your memory is faulty. That's why two people who witnessed the very same event will recall it differently. Another example of episodic memory is when you see someone out of context and you're sure you know them, but you can't place where you've seen them before. This happens a lot with people who go to the gym to work out. They're all used to seeing certain faces at the gym. But when they see one of those same faces in a grocery store, they think, I know that person, but from where? The next kind of memory is verbal memory. This refers to your ability to remember names of people, objects, places, and facts. It has a lot to do with your language skills. Of course, verbal memory is mostly dependent on your ability to store such information in your brain in the first place. After that, though, it's about your ability to retrieve it at the right time. Women tend to have better verbal memories than men, but that's because women are more verbal than men, period. And verbal memory loss is what women complain about most when they go through menopause. They find themselves with a word on the tip of their tongue. Or they think of something one minute but forget it the next. They know it's stored in their brain, but they can't retrieve it efficiently at that moment. It's maddening, isn't it? But don't assume that forgetting a name or a word constitutes Alzheimer's. It doesn't. Right now, all we're doing is designating the different kinds of memory. Another type of memory is something called recognition memory. This has to do with recognizing familiar things. The most basic form of recognition memory pertains to recognizing faces. And facial recognition is something you learn very early in life, and it enables you to identify those with whom you have relationships and separate them from strangers. Recognition memory is intimately connected to emotional memory. Now, this is true to such an extent that we sometimes confuse one for the other. For instance, you can mistake recognition memory for an actual emotion. That is precisely what happens when you say, I feel like I know that person. What you really mean is that you think you recognize that person. But it feels more like an emotion than a thought. But that's not the only form of recognition memory. You also rely on recognition memory when you've got something stored in your brain, but you haven't used it in ages. And it's like you've forgotten that it's there. But then something happens that jogs your memory and you recognize it. And it can be emotional, muscular, or verbal. And when it makes itself available, it sort of surprises you. You may not even know why you know it. This happens when you encounter someone you haven't seen for decades. Or maybe you help your grandchild with a homework assignment that brings back memories of a subject you hadn't utilized since grade school yourself. And you sometimes discover that you remember a lot more than you realized. A more complex form of memory is learning memory. This really constitutes learning how to learn. Learning is not automatic. Learning requires paying attention, focusing, repetition, memorization. When you were a kid in school, you probably had to memorize things. Well, the reason your teachers made you do that was to teach you how to learn. And once you memorize something, it's easy to retrieve it. But it really depends on how much you use the information after you've memorized it. If you memorize something just long enough to pass a test and then never think about it again, you will not really have learned it. But if you memorize something and then retrieve it over and over again, you will have really learned it. You probably notice that I come back around to things over and over in these videos. The first time you hear a fact, you probably react with shock, maybe even disbelief. The second time, you probably say, oh yeah, I remember that. And the third time, you probably can say it with me. And after that, you can use it to help connect the dots as other new information comes along. All of these things constitute learning memory. Learning is a skill, but you have to practice it in order to actually do it. If you stop practicing it, you impair your ability to learn. Another kind of memory is organizational memory. This refers to how you catalog information in your mind so that it's easy for you to retrieve it. Of course, it can refer to how well you organize your life, too. We all know that some of us are very well organized and others are not. I'm an organization freak. Everything in my life is organized to the nth degree. My closet is organized by category and color. It looks like a rainbow. My file drawers are all alphabetical. I don't do anything without incorporating some kind of organizational scheme to it. And because I'm so organized, I never lose anything. Misplacing something is completely foreign to me because everything has its place, and I never think it's easier to put anything anywhere other than where it belongs. Some people are very disorganized. In fact, for them, organizing anything is a huge chore because they simply don't know where to begin. And even if someone else organizes their things for them, they can't keep them organized. This tendency to be either organized or disorganized is a reflection of how your brain works. An organized brain stores information differently than a disorganized brain. Both can be equally intelligent. There's just a difference in the storage and retrieval of information. When you lose things or can't find things that only you have handled, your organizational memory is faulty. And problems with your organizational memory can affect you in the short term or the long term. You might forget where you put your keys even though they were in your hands just 5 minutes ago. Or you may forget where you put items that you organized years ago while moving into your new house. They both rely on your organizational memory. Yet another kind of memory is intuitive memory. Intuitive memory is when you know two separate things that have no obvious relationship to one another. But your knowledge of each separately enables you to see relationships between them. Intuitive memory is what some would call logic. Much of what you are learning from your education here at Menopause University is intuitive. It enables you to reason. I had a consultation with a woman not too long ago. And you know, when you have a consultation with me, I send you a very long document 72 hours before the consultation so that you have a foundation with which to utilize your consultation time efficiently. That document basically summarizes this whole education. And one of the topics is the difference between the primary purpose of HRT and the secondary purpose of HRT. If you haven't watched all my videos in order and don't know what I'm talking about, the primary purpose of HRT is to alleviate your symptoms of menopause. The secondary purpose of HRT is to prevent the diseases associated with menopause. Well, this woman had learned how common and severe the diseases associated with menopause are. They include heart attack, osteoporosis, and Alzheimer's. And even though she had learned about the diseases separately from learning about the primary and secondary purposes of HRT, she said, shouldn't the primary and secondary purposes be reversed? That's intuition. That's taking two separate pieces of information, seeing the relationship between them, and drawing a conclusion about how they actually relate to one another. This is something that increases as you age. You get wiser. You see the big picture much more readily. You see the consequences of actions that are not obvious to others. So there's some great benefits in aging, you see. So there you have 9 different kinds of memory. There's emotional memory, muscle memory, orientation memory, episodic memory, verbal memory, recognition memory, learning memory, organizational memory, and intuitive memory. Now, all of these have other, more sophisticated and scientific names. And if you read a lot of neuroscience texts like I do, you'll encounter them. But I'm going to keep it really simple. The names I've used make it easy for you to distinguish one type of memory from another just by their names alone. But there are 2 other features that you need to designate with each one of these kinds of memory. Every one of these kinds of memory can be voluntary or involuntary, and every one of them can be short-term or long-term. Voluntary memories are those that you actively try to recall. Depending on the situation, you may have to actively search your memory to retrieve any one of them. Alternatively, involuntary memories are those that are automatic, requiring no thought on your part. And depending on the situation, you may be able to do any one of them without thought. It just depends on your past experiences or how much you've done them in the past. What requires tremendous active and voluntary retrieval of information for one person may be automatic for another. The other distinction that can apply to any one of these types of memories is short-term versus long-term. Short-term memories are things that happened recently. They include things like remembering what you ate for breakfast today or remembering something you learned yesterday. If you're learning a new language, do you recall the proper use of the grammar you covered in class yesterday? Long-term memory pertains to things that you learned or did long ago. You may have learned to play a piece on the piano when you were 6 years old, and you may still remember how to play it today, even though you don't even play the piano. You may remember the address of your house in grade school, even though your family sold that house 50 years ago. These distinctions between voluntary versus involuntary and short-term versus long-term will be an important part of your understanding of Alzheimer's. Oops, I said it again. I knew I would. Okay, so here's a chart reflecting what we've covered today. There's nothing complicated about it. It's simply the 9 different kinds of memories listed in the first column and the distinguishing features in the other columns, including voluntary and involuntary, short-term and long-term. All of these will be important in our future videos on this topic that I'm not supposed to mention. You see, that's an example of verbal, muscular, intuitive, voluntary, short-term memory. The chart is not filled in because it doesn't need to be yet. The content of each cell is obvious, and each type of memory can be voluntary or involuntary, short-term or long-term. But we will use this chart in the next video. For now, just understand the 4 different variables that exist for each kind of memory. And that's it for today. Come back next week to learn about the different kinds of dementia. Please go to menopausetailor.me to schedule consultations. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and you can subscribe right here and now. See you next week. Bye.